You buried family. Nobody leaves hungry. She tore up the check before she even realized what her hands were doing. If that just hit you somewhere deep, stay with me. This story is going to take you somewhere you won't forget. Hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. Hannah Monroe had learned a long time ago that the universe doesn't negotiate. It doesn't send warnings. It doesn't clear its throat before it hits you. It just hits you right when you think you finally found your footing, right when you've convinced yourself that maybe, just maybe, things are starting to turn around. And on that cold Tuesday morning in November, standing behind the cracked laminate counter of the Dusty Mile Diner on the outskirts of Maricopa County, Arizona, Hannah Monroe was already on her knees before the day had even properly started. She was 52 years old, blonde hair that used to catch the light a certain way when her husband Danny would walk through the door, now pulled back in a ponytail that was more habit than vanity. Her hands had the kind of roughness that comes not from one hard year, but from many. The calluses on her fingers from carrying heavy plates, the small burn scar on her left forearm from a fryer accident 3 years back, the way she moved through the diner, efficient, purposeful, a little hunched at the shoulders like a woman who had spent too long bracing for the next bad thing. The Dusty Mile was the kind of place that had been almost closing for a decade. The neon sign in the window still said open 24 hours, but the two had been flickering since September. The booths had duct tape on the corners. The coffee was strong because Dale Purcell, the owner and manager, believed that if the coffee was strong enough, people wouldn't notice everything else was falling apart. Dale was wrong about a lot of things. Hannah had been working at the Dusty Mile for 6 years. She'd started 2 months after Danny's funeral when the medical bills had begun arriving in waves, not all at once, which might have been easier to face, but in slow, staggered sequences, like the universe was pacing itself. First the oncology bills, then the hospital stay invoices, then the pharmacy statements, then the collections letters, then the second collections letters, these ones with red print along the top as though the color alone might shake loose money she didn't have. And she'd gotten the job because she needed it and because Dale hadn't asked too many questions. That was the arrangement. She didn't ask about the cockroach she'd found behind the prep station in her first week. He didn't ask about the dark circles under her eyes or the way she sometimes had to step into the walk-in freezer for 2 minutes just to pull herself back together. It was an imperfect agreement between two people who both needed something from the other and had learned not to push too hard on anything fragile. Her son Ethan was 17. He was the kind of kid who made it easy to forget he was suffering, which was in itself its own kind of suffering. He didn't complain. He didn't throw fits or act out or demand things Hannah couldn't give him. He just quietly adjusted. He ate less when he noticed the pantry was getting thin. He turned off lights in rooms he wasn't using. He'd stopped asking for things the way other teenagers ask casually without expectation of refusal. Ethan asked for nothing, and that nothing was the thing that kept Hannah up at 3 a.m. more than the bills, more than the loneliness, more than the memory of Danny's laugh, which she could still hear sometimes if the trailer was quiet enough. That Tuesday morning, Hannah had left the trailer at 4:47 a.m. She knew the exact time because she always checked the electric clock on the kitchen wall on her way out, partly out of habit, partly because she was afraid of what the clock represented. The electric bill was 3 weeks past due. $41. In the broader geography of her debt, $41 was almost laughable, but it was $41 she did not have. She'd counted what was in her wallet before she left the trailer. $63 and some change. That was it. That was everything until Friday's paycheck, which after Dale's deductions for the broken coffee carafe that Hannah maintained she had not broken, was going to come in somewhere around $112. $112 for a week's worth of working 6-hour shifts, 6 days a week on feet that ached from the arch to the ankle, and a back that had started making a new sound, a low, grinding complaint every time she bent to pick something up from the floor. She'd been calculating on the drive over. She did this often, the mental math of survival, $63 in change, minus the electric bill that left $22. Minus the 2 gallons of milk and the bread and the eggs she absolutely had to pick up for Ethan before Thursday that left maybe $8 or $9. And she still needed gas. And Ethan's school had sent home a permission slip for a field trip that cost $15, and he'd shoved it in his backpack and said nothing about it, and she'd only found it because she'd been looking for a pen. She hadn't told Ethan she'd found the slip. She just tucked it back where she found it and told herself she'd figure it out by Wednesday. This was how Hannah Monroe lived, in the small gaps between crises, in the 2-day window between realizing she didn't have enough and somehow having just enough. She was not a woman who had given up. There's a difference, a crucial one, between a woman who has given up and a woman who is exhausted. Hannah was exhausted. She still showed up. And the diner filled slowly that morning. A couple of truckers, a road crew from the county who came in every Tuesday. An older woman named Patsy who always ordered the same thing, 2 eggs over easy white toast, black coffee, and who Hannah always made sure got a little extra on her plate because Patsy had once mentioned offhandedly that she didn't always eat dinner. Well, Dale arrived at 7:15 and spent the first 20 minutes of his morning walking through the diner with the particular energy of a man who believed the entire establishment would collapse without his constant surveillance. He checked the napkin holders. He checked the syrup levels. He pointed out to Hannah that table 4 had a smudge on the window that she had in fact already cleaned twice that morning. Hannah nodded and said she'd get it. Dale said she should have gotten it already. Hannah turned away before he could see her jaw tighten. By 8:30, the morning rush had died down to a comfortable lull. Hannah was refilling the salt shakers at the counter when the bell above the door rang. She didn't look up right away. She heard them before she saw them. Not the noise of rowdy men, but something heavier. The sound of boots on linoleum. The sound of men who moved carefully the way people move when they're carrying something invisible and trying not to spill it. When Hannah did look up, she counted 5 of them filing through the door. But they were bikers. That much was obvious from the leather, the patches, the road-worn look that comes from long miles in open air. But what stopped Hannah, what actually made her set down the salt shaker, was their faces. She'd waited tables long enough to read a room in about 10 seconds, and what she read on those 5 faces wasn't trouble. It was grief. Raw, fresh, unprocessed grief of the kind that hadn't yet settled into anything manageable. Red eyes on 2 of them. The particular stillness of men who hadn't slept. The way the oldest one, heavy-set gray at the temples, a face like weathered stone, scanned the diner. Not the way dangerous men scan rooms looking for exits and angles, but the way lost men do looking for somewhere to put themselves down. Anywhere, the older one asked. Anywhere you like, Hannah said. Neton, they took the big corner booth. All 5 of them pressed together, leather shoulders touching. They didn't look at the menus immediately. They just sat there for a moment, and Hannah gave them that moment without apology, didn't rush over, didn't hover, didn't perform the cheerful waitress come-right-away thing that Dale had trained into her. She waited until she could see they were ready, and then she walked over with her notepad. "Coffee?" she asked, and the older one looked up at her. His eyes were dark, and there was a rawness in them that he wasn't trying to hide. "Please," he said, "all around." She poured 5 coffees without writing anything down. She looked at the oldest one and said quietly, "You all okay?" He considered the question. "Lost a brother yesterday," he said. "Long drive in." Hannah nodded. She didn't say she was sorry because she knew how that landed after a while, like a stone dropped in water, making a small splash and then meaning nothing. She said, "Take your time." Both they ordered big. She could see them doing the thing people do when they're hungry, but trying not to show it, scanning the menu twice. Eyes lingering on prices, the small recalibration she recognized from every tight month she'd ever lived through. They ordered eggs and bacon and pancakes and hash browns and toast and more coffee, and Hannah wrote it all down without comment and put the order in and brought the food out herself in 2 trips, and she made sure every plate was full. And they ate the way men eat when they haven't eaten in too long. Not fast, but with a certain total attention to the food, the kind of attention that meant the food was doing something more than filling a stomach. Hannah refilled their coffees twice without being asked. The second time, one of the younger ones, maybe 30, dark-haired, a tattoo climbing the side of his neck, looked up at her and said, "You're good at this." "At what?" Hannah asked. "Knowing when to leave people alone and when not to." She almost said something light and deflective, which was her instinct. Instead, she just said, "Lost someone myself a while back, you learn." The young one nodded. That was enough. And when the table finally sat back, the particular lean of men who have been fed and have begun to return to themselves, Hannah tore the ticket off her pad and walked it over. $23.40 for 5 men, which in the quiet arithmetic of her morning meant she'd charge them exactly the menu price on everything and resisted the reflex to round anything up. She set the check face down in the middle of the table, the way she always did, giving people the dignity of looking at the number without her standing over them. She walked back to the counter and started on the salt shakers again. She wasn't watching them. She had trained herself not to watch customers look at checks because sometimes what you saw in their face was something private, and she had her own private things she didn't want witnessed. But she heard the booth go quiet, not the regular quiet of men finishing their meal, a different kind, a tight, compressed silence. She glanced over. The older man had the check in his hand and was looking at it with an expression that had shifted entirely from what she'd seen before. The grief was still there, but now there was something else layered under it, a particular shame that Hannah recognized from the inside, the shame of being in a public place without enough money and knowing that someone is about to find out. He looked up. Their eyes met. He held the check toward her like a man holding evidence of something he wished he could disappear. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low. "I need to be straight with you." Hannah walked back to the table. "We've been on the road since yesterday morning," he said. "Buried a man last night. Good man. Our brother. And the truth is," he stopped, set his jaw, started again. "We pooled everything we had left to cover the funeral costs. What's left between the five of us is gas money. Barely that." He laid the check on the table. "I'm not asking for charity. I've never asked for charity in my life. I'll wash dishes. We'll all wash dishes. Whatever you need. But I want you to know the situation because it's the honest thing to do, and I won't have you blindsided." Hannah stood still. She looked at the check, $67.14. She looked at the five men. The youngest one had his hands flat on the table. The one with the neck tattoo was staring at the window. One of the others, heavy-set, maybe 45, with a beard going silver, had his eyes closed like he was trying to manage something internal. Hannah thought about the electric bill. She thought about Ethan's permission slip. She thought about the drive home and the gas gauge that had been sitting on a quarter tank since Sunday, and the particular knot in her chest that came from too many small calculations running simultaneously. She picked up the check. She looked at it for one long second. Then she tore it in half. Then she tore those halves in half again. She set the pieces on the table and she looked at the older man and she said, "You buried family. Nobody leaves hungry." The man stared at her. He opened his mouth once and closed it. His eyes, those dark, road-hardened eyes that had clearly seen more than most people would see in 3 lifetimes, went bright for just a second. He pressed his lips together and looked down at the table. "We can't accept." "You already ate," Hannah said, and there was no argument in her voice, no performance of generosity, nothing that asked to be thanked or witnessed. Just a statement of fact. The transaction was complete. The matter was settled. "Travel safe," she said. "Road looks clear today." She walked back to the counter. Her hands were shaking. She hadn't fully realized until that moment that she'd just given away $67 of food on a morning when she had $63 in her wallet and an electric bill that was going to disconnect by Thursday. The math was simple and it was brutal, and she stood behind the counter doing it slowly, the way you do when you already know the answer but aren't ready to arrive at it. The 5 men sat in the booth for another few minutes. She didn't look at them. She heard the creak of the booth as they stood. She heard the slow, measured sound of their boots crossing the linoleum. She kept her eyes on the coffee maker in front of her until the bell above the door rang, and then she exhaled long and slow and gripped the counter's edge. She had 38 seconds of quiet. Then Dale Purcell's office door opened. She knew from the sound of his footsteps that it was going to be bad. Dale had 2 kinds of walk, the regular kind, when everything was fine, and the fast, hard-heeled kind that meant someone was about to hear about something. What she heard coming across the diner floor toward her was the second kind. Monroe. His voice had the particular edge of a man who had been watching from a distance and had decided that distance was over. She turned. Dale was a short man, which hadn't made him mean by itself, but years of being underestimated had built something in him that expressed itself as a need to be the loudest presence in any room he entered. His face was red in a way that suggested this was not the beginning of his anger, but somewhere in the middle of it, that he had been building to this in his office, watching through the window in his door, letting himself get good and certain before coming out. "What was that?" he said. "I comped a table," Hannah said. "You comped a table," Dale repeated. He said it the way people repeat things when they want you to hear how stupid the thing sounds. "You comped a $67 table. Out of whose pocket, Hannah?" "Out of mine. Is that what you think this is? Your personal charity operation?" Several of the remaining customers in the diner had gone quiet. Hannah could feel it, the stilled forks, the heads slightly turned, the uncomfortable performance of people pretending not to watch while watching intently. "They lost someone," Hannah said. "They had nothing left." "I don't care if they lost the President of the United States," Dale said. He wasn't yelling, which was somehow worse than yelling, because his voice was perfectly controlled, perfectly mean, perfectly aware of its audience. "You do not give away food in my diner without authorization. You know this. You have known this for 6 years. I have a business to run." "It was the right thing to do," Hannah said. Dale looked at her for a long moment. His expression settled into something cold and very deliberate. $67.14, he said. "I'm pulling it from your check Friday." Hannah felt the floor shift under her. She knew she couldn't argue it. She knew the rules written and unwritten, and she knew Dale well enough to know that pushing back right now in front of customers would cost her more than $67. It could cost her the job entirely, and as bad as the job was, it was the thing holding everything else up. So she nodded, once. Her face did nothing that Dale could hold against her. Dale pointed at her with one finger the way people point when they want the gesture itself to carry meaning beyond the words. "Get back to work," he said. He turned and walked back to his office. The door didn't slam. It clicked, which was quieter and somehow worse. Hannah turned back to the coffee maker. Her reflection in the metal surface looked back at her, distorted and small and tired. She thought about Friday's paycheck. She thought about $112 minus $67.14. She stood very still and did the arithmetic, and when she was done doing the arithmetic, she stood there a moment longer, and then she straightened her back, and she picked up the coffee pot, and she walked to table 3 and refilled a trucker's cup without spilling a drop. Because that was what she did. Because that was who she was. Because sometimes surviving isn't a decision you make once. It's a decision you make again every hour in small, quiet ways while the world watches and doesn't notice. And Hannah Monroe had been making that decision for a long time. She just didn't know yet that $67.14 was about to make history. The $67 came out of her paycheck on Friday exactly the way Dale said it would. Hannah held the envelope in the parking lot of the diner and opened it standing next to her car, a 2009 Civic with a driver's side window that didn't roll all the way down and a check engine light that had been on so long she'd stopped seeing it. She counted the bills twice. $44.86. That was what 6 days of work had produced after Dale's deduction. $44.86, and she stood there in the afternoon heat, holding it with both hands like it might blow away. And she put it in her wallet. She got into the car. She sat there for a moment with both hands on the wheel, and she did not cry because she had learned a long time ago that crying in parking lots used up time she didn't have. And because Ethan was home waiting, and she needed to stop at the grocery store, and she had exactly $22 she could spend there without overdrafting the account she shared with the ghost of a marriage that had ended 3 years ago. She bought milk, eggs, bread, peanut butter, and a small bag of apples. She stood in the checkout line and added the total in her head before the cashier finished scanning, and she was off by 40 cents in the wrong direction, so she put the apples back. Ethan wouldn't say anything about the apples. That was the thing about Ethan. He never said anything about the things that disappeared from the house. He just quietly adjusted, and that quiet adjustment was the thing Hannah carried home with her heavier than the groceries. When she got to this trailer, Ethan was at the kitchen table doing homework. He was a serious boy with his father's eyes, in a way of sitting very still when he was thinking, that reminded her so much of Danny. Sometimes it physically hurt a quick, sharp thing in the chest that passed before she could do anything with it. He looked up when she came in. "How was it?" he asked. "Fine," Hannah said, which was what she always said. He nodded and went back to his work, and she put the groceries away and made them both eggs and toast for dinner. And they ate at the kitchen table and talked about his history class and the project he was doing on the New Deal. And it was a normal evening, which meant it was also a painful one because normal evenings had a way of reminding her exactly how far they were from the life they'd had before Danny got sick. And after Ethan went to bed, Hannah sat at the kitchen table with her bills spread out in front of her. She did this the way a surgeon does a procedure, with focus and without flinching, because flinching didn't help anything. Electric bill, past due. Rent, due was in 11 days. She was $412 short of the rent. She had not been $400 short before. She had been close before, threateningly close, white-knuckle close, but $412 was a different kind of number. That was a number that didn't bend. She sat at that table until after midnight. She moved numbers around in her head the way you rearrange furniture in a room that's too small, trying to make the space work through sheer creative effort. It never worked. The room was still too small. The numbers still didn't add up. But she sat there until she was too tired to think clearly, and then she went to bed and she lay in the dark and listened to the trailer settle around her. And she thought about those 5 bikers, the oldest one's face when he'd held the check toward her, the brightness that had come into his eyes for just a second before he looked away, and she wondered where they were tonight, whether they were home, whether home was something they had. She hoped they were safe. She genuinely hoped that even now, with the $44 in her wallet and the $400 gap sitting in her chest like a stone, she hoped it the way good people hope for strangers, without expecting anything back, without the hope being conditional on anything. She'd done what she'd done, and she would do it again, and that was all there was to say about it. She was asleep by 12:40. She did not know that at that exact moment, roughly 230 miles northwest of her trailer, 5 motorcycles were pulling into the parking lot of a roadside motel outside Kingman, Arizona. She did not know that inside room 7 and room 8 of that motel, 5 men were sitting on the edges of their beds and on the floor with their backs against the wall, not sleeping, not ready to sleep. The particular wakefulness of people who have buried someone and haven't yet put the day down. She did not know that the oldest one, the one who had spoken to her, the one with the dark eyes and the stone face, was sitting on the edge of his bed with a bottle of water in his hands that he wasn't drinking, staring at the floor with the fixed look of a man replaying something in his mind on a loop. His name was Mason Ryder. That was what the others called him, though, inside the Brotherhood, and the Brotherhood was larger than most people outside it understood. He was called Graves. Not for anything dark, despite how it sounded. He'd been given the name 20 years ago after he'd personally handled the burial arrangements for 3 brothers killed in a highway accident outside Tulsa, and he'd done it without being asked, and he'd done it with a thoroughness and a dignity that people still talked about. You were called what you earned. That was the rule. Mason Ryder had earned Graves. He was 58 years old. He had ridden more miles than he could count, had attended more funerals than most people 3 times his age, had sat with more grieving families, in more motel rooms just like this one, and he had developed over decades a very specific and reliable internal compass for what mattered and what didn't. It had rarely failed him. He was thinking about the waitress, and he was thinking about the way she'd looked at the check, the way she'd held it, not casually but with a specific weight, like the number on it had a physical mass she was feeling. He'd read people his whole adult life, and what he'd read in Hannah Monroe's face in that 2-second window before she tore the check had not been the easy generosity of someone who could afford to be generous. It had been something harder and more deliberate. It had been the decision of someone who could not afford it and was doing it anyway. He thought about that for a long time. Graves, that was Denny from the next bed. Denny was 31, the youngest of the 5, the one with the neck tattoo. You need to sleep. I know, Mason said. Then sleep. I'm working on it. A silence. Then Denny said, You're thinking about her. Mason looked up. Am I that obvious? You've been staring at the same spot on the floor for 20 minutes. Mason set the water bottle down on the nightstand. She didn't have it, he said. That money. I could see it. She didn't have it and she gave it anyway. Denny was quiet for a moment. Some people are just like that. Yeah, Mason said. Not many, but some. Another silence. Then, what are you thinking? Mason rubbed a hand over his face. I'm thinking about what Tommy would have said. Tommy, that was the one they'd buried. Tommy Briggs, 55 years old, 16 years in the Brotherhood, the kind of man who remembered every birthday and never once asked to be thanked for remembering. The kind of man who, if he'd been sitting at that booth this morning and watched a waitress tear up a $67 check, would have been on his phone before the ink dried, making calls, making things happen, because Tommy believed with a totality that most people reserve for religion, that you paid goodness back double and you did it fast before the world had a chance to grind it down. He'd have said we owe her, Denny said. More than that, Mason said. He'd have said we owe her and we don't wait around to figure out how. Denny was quiet for a moment. Then, so what do we do? Mason picked up his phone. Mason was late, past midnight, but in the network Mason operated in, calls at midnight were not unusual. The Brotherhood was not a 9-to-5 organization. It was a living thing spread across 14 states, built on relationships and trust, and the particular loyalty of people who had at one point or another needed each other in a real and urgent way. Mason had built and maintained those relationships for 20 years. He had banked more goodwill than most people could comprehend, and he had spent almost none of it on himself. He found the first number and pressed call. The phone rang twice. Graves. The voice on the other end was rough familiar. It's midnight. I know it is, Mason said. I've got something I need to tell you. It won't take long. Go ahead. Mason told the story the way he lived it, straight through, no embellishment, no editorializing. The diner, the 5 of them walking in off the road, still wearing their grief from the funeral. The breakfast, the bill, the waitress with the tired eyes who had looked at $67 and torn it in half and said what she'd said. He told it plainly, which was how plain things deserved to be told, and when he finished, there was a silence on the other end. She have family, the voice said. A kid, son, teenager. She doing okay financially? No, Mason said. She is not. Another silence. Shorter this time. I'll make some calls, the voice said. Tonight, Mason said. What kind of question is that? Yes, tonight. Get some sleep, Graves. I'll handle this. The call ended. Mason sat for a moment, then he called another number. Then another. By the time he put the phone down, it was nearly 2 a.m, and he had made 7 calls and told the story 7 times and received the same response each time. A brief silence, a question or two, and then I'll handle it. Because these were people who handled things. Because that was the culture Mason had spent 20 years building, not a culture of posturing or performance, but one of actual concrete show up and do the work loyalty. He put the phone on the nightstand and lay back on the bed. He stared at the ceiling. You going to sleep now? Denny asked from the other bed. I think so, Mason said. Good, because you're 60 years old. 58. And you look terrible. Thank you, Denny. Just being honest. Mason closed his eyes. He thought about Tommy one more time. The way Tommy had laughed big and unrestrained, the kind of laugh that made other people laugh just because of its sheer volume and conviction. He thought about the fact that Tommy would have loved this. The waitress, the story, the whole improbable thing. Tommy would have been awake right now, calling people, getting loud about it, using all his considerable energy to make the thing happen as fast as possible. All right, Tommy, Mason said quietly to the ceiling, to the dark. We're going. He slept. On to what happened next moved through the biker networks of the American Southwest, the way fire moves through dry grass, not in a straight line, but in all directions at once, jumping gaps, finding fuel wherever it existed, unstoppable once it had started. Mason's 7 calls became 30 calls by dawn. Those 30 calls became 140 by noon the following day. The story traveled through encrypted chats, through regional network channels, through phone calls made in the parking lots of bike shops and roadside diners and clubhouses from Arizona to New Mexico to Texas to Nevada to California. The story was always the same when it was told because Mason had told it straight and the people he told it to had repeated it straight, and that fidelity to the actual facts was part of what made it spread the way it did. It wasn't dressed up. It wasn't made into something larger than itself. It was just, here is what happened. A woman with nothing left gave away what she had to men she didn't know because it was the right thing to do. And then she went back to work. That last part, and then she went back to work, was the part that got people because they knew what it meant. They understood, many of them from personal experience, what it meant to give away the thing you couldn't spare and then keep going anyway quietly without fanfare. because the world doesn't stop for your sacrifice. They understood the math, and the math of Hannah Monroe's life, when it circulated through these networks, landed like a physical thing. Money began moving, not in one large gesture, but in dozens of small ones first. A biker in Flagstaff who heard the story called his chapter treasurer and authorized a contribution from the chapter fund before he'd finished his morning coffee. A group of riders in Albuquerque had a collection in the parking lot of their regular meeting spot and raised $800 in 11 minutes. A woman in Las Vegas, not a biker herself, but married to one for 30 years, heard the story from her husband and wired money from their personal account and then called her sister in Tucson and told her to do the same. And then the larger organizations got involved. Well, this was where Mason's position in the national network mattered enormously. He was not a regional figure. He was not someone whose reach was limited to a single state or a single brotherhood. He had spent 2 decades building relationships across organizational lines, across the tribal divisions that usually kept different groups separate. When word reached the national chapters, and it reached them by Saturday afternoon, less than 4 days after the Tuesday morning at the Dusty Mile, the response was not slow or considered. It was immediate. Calls went out from national leadership to regional presidents. Regional presidents called chapter presidents. Chapter presidents called their people. And at each level of this cascade, the same question was asked and answered. Are you in? And the answer overwhelmingly reliably with a speed that surprised even Mason when he started hearing the reports was yes. Because here was the thing that people outside this world didn't understand, the thing that all the leather and chrome and Hollywood mythology obscured these, were people who had built a culture around loyalty to the broken. Many of them had been broke themselves. Many of them had been in hospitals with no one to call. Many of them had lost people and held the loss alone because the world didn't make room for their grief. The story of Hannah Monroe didn't land for them as a feel-good story about a generous woman. It landed as something they recognized from the inside. It landed as a story of one of their own, even though she'd never ridden a mile in her life. Meanwhile, Hannah Monroe was working Saturday's double shift at the Dusty Mile, completely unaware that her name was moving through a network of thousands of people across 6 states. Saturday was a hard day. Dale was in a particular mood, the kind that came when he'd had a bad week and needed somewhere to put it. He found small things to pick at. The coffee wasn't strong enough. The pie display needed rotating. He told Hannah twice that her section was slow, which wasn't true, but which she knew better than to argue. She smiled where smiling was appropriate and stayed invisible where invisibility was safer. And she watched the clock, and she got through it. At her 15-minute break, she sat in the back room and texted Ethan. Just checking in, she wrote. You eat. He texted back, PB sandwich. You okay? She looked at that message for a moment. Her 17-year-old son in their trailer, eating peanut butter by himself on a Saturday afternoon, asking if she was okay. She typed, always, home by 8. She put the phone in her apron and went back out. She did not know that at that moment on a Saturday afternoon, Mason Ryder was sitting in a meeting in Phoenix with 11 other men maps on the table, phones going constantly, building something that had never quite been done before in this particular form. She did not know they were talking about her, specifically that her name, Hannah Monroe, Dusty Mile Diner, Maricopa County, was on a piece of paper in the middle of that table, that someone had already located her trailer address through public records and written it down in careful handwriting at the top of the page. She did not know any of it. She went home at 8:15. Ethan had made pasta from a box, which she hadn't asked him to do, which meant he'd done it because he knew she'd be tired. They ate together and watched television for an hour, a nature documentary about elephants, which was Ethan's pick, and which he'd never admit was his pick because he thought it wasn't cool. And then he went to bed and she sat up alone for another hour going over the numbers again. Well, for $412 short of rent. She'd thought about it all day in between orders. She'd done and redone the arithmetic. She'd considered asking Dale for an advance, which she'd never done before, which she never wanted to do because she knew how Dale would hold it over her afterward, not aggressively, but with the particular casual cruelty of someone who waits until you're dependent and then reminds you of it. She'd decided not to ask Dale. She would figure something else out. She always figured something else out. And she went to bed at 11:30. She was asleep by 11:43. The calls kept moving through the night. By Sunday morning, Mason had heard back from organizers in 4 states. By Sunday evening, he had a number, roughly the number of riders who had committed to the convoy, who had cleared their schedules, who had said without hesitation or condition that they would be there. When his lieutenant, a man named Holt, who had been with Mason for 15 years and who had the organizational mind of a military general, told him the number, Mason sat back in his chair and was quiet for a moment. "How confident are you in that number?" Mason asked. "Very," Holt said. "Could be more. Might be closer to 600 by the time everyone who said probably makes up their mind." Mason absorbed this. Wednesday, 5:30 a.m. "You've confirmed the address?" "3 times, Holt said. "Trailer park outside Maricopa, Sunrise Desert Mobile Estates." "What about the other pieces, the mechanics, the electricians?" "Lined up," Holt said. "I've got a licensed electrician who says he can restore power same morning. Got a roofing crew out of Scottsdale who heard the story and volunteered the materials and labor. Mechanic shop in Chandler is sending 2 guys with a flatbed for whatever the car needs." He paused. "Mason, I've been doing this for 15 years. I've never organized something that came together this fast." "Because it's right," Mason said simply. Holt nodded. "Because it's right." Mason pulled out his phone. He had one more call to make, the one he'd been thinking about since Thursday night, since the moment he'd lain on that motel bed and thought about Tommy's laugh and told the ceiling he was going. He'd been saving this call because it was the most important one, and he wanted to make it when he was certain. He was certain now. He dialed. The call was answered on the second ring by a man named Gerald Sims, who ran the largest biker advocacy foundation in the Southwest, and who had over a career spanning 2 decades directed more charitable funds than most nonprofit executives half his age. "Graves," Gerald said. "I've been waiting for you to call." "You heard," Mason said. "Everybody's heard. What do you need from me?" "Scholarship fund," Mason said. "For the kid. Sustainable. Something that goes somewhere." Gerald was quiet for a moment, not the silence of hesitation, but the silence of someone doing real calculation. "I can set up the framework this week. We'll need a formal vehicle, I'm thinking a named fund, through our foundation, which gives it tax-exempt status and makes it easy for people to contribute ongoing. We seed it with what's already been collected." He paused. "How much are we looking at?" Mason told him the number Holt had given him. Gerald was quiet for a longer moment this time. "That's substantial," Gerald said. "People feel strongly about this," Mason said. "Apparently." Another pause. "All right, I'll have the framework ready by Tuesday. The scholarship fund will be operational before she knows it exists." Mason closed his eyes for a second. "Thank you, Gerald." "Don't thank me," Gerald said, and his voice had something in it that was hard to name, not quite emotion, not quite professionalism, something in between. "Thank her when you see her. Tell her what she started." Mason ended the call. He sat in the quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Holt across the table. "Wednesday," Mason said, 5:30 a.m. Holt nodded. "Make sure everyone understands the protocol," Mason said. "Slow approach, no aggression. This woman has a teenage son and she has no idea what's coming, and the last thing I want is for her to be frightened." "Understood." "And Holt," Mason paused, "make sure every man who rides knows why he's riding, not as a gesture, not as a photo opportunity. They ride because a woman with nothing left gave everything she had to our brothers on the worst day of their lives. They ride because Tommy would have ridden. That's the message. That's the only message." Holt said nothing for a moment. "Then I'll make sure they know." In her trailer in Maricopa County, Hannah Monroe slept. She didn't know about the calls or the planning or the 500 people who were quietly, methodically turning their lives around to show up for her. She didn't know her story was being told in kitchens and parking lots and on porches from Phoenix to El Paso. She didn't know that a scholarship fund was being built with her son's name on it, that electricians and roofers and mechanics had cleared their Wednesday schedules, that trucks were being loaded and routes were being planned. She was asleep. She had work in the morning. And 41 hours from now, the ground beneath her trailer was going to shake. Hannah worked Tuesday like she worked every day by not thinking too far ahead. That was the discipline she'd developed somewhere in the 2 years after Danny died. Somewhere between the second collections letter and the first time she'd had to tell Ethan they were having cereal for dinner because she'd miscalculated the week. You didn't think about the whole mountain. You thought about the next step. You thought about the table in front of you, the order in your hand, the pot of coffee that needed refilling. You thought about small, manageable things, and you let the large, unbearable things sit at the edge of your peripheral vision where they couldn't flatten you. A Tuesday shift was slow in the way that Tuesdays at the Dusty Mile were always slow, not dead but thin. Enough customers to keep moving, not enough to stop thinking. Dale was in his office for most of the morning, which was its own kind of relief, the way an absence of pain is its own kind of comfort. Hannah refilled ketchup bottles and wiped down the counter and exchanged a few words with the road crew that came in at 10, and she thought about rent, and she thought about the $41 electric bill that was now officially past due, and she thought about Ethan's permission slip that was still in his backpack, and she kept all of these thoughts in the peripheral zone where they belonged, and she kept moving. She got home at 3:15. Ethan wasn't back from school yet. She changed out of her uniform and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the bills again, not because she expected the numbers to have changed, but because sitting with them felt better than avoiding them, which was a philosophy she couldn't entirely explain, but had learned to trust. $412, still there, still the same number it had been for 4 days. She'd made $17 in tips on Tuesday. She added it to the mental column, and it still didn't matter. Ethan came home at 4. He dropped his backpack by the door and came into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator and stood in front of it for a moment in the way teenagers stand in front of open refrigerators, not looking for something specific, just existing in proximity to food. "There's peanut butter," Hannah said. "I know," Ethan said. He closed the fridge. He looked at her. He had Danny's eyes, that particular dark, direct gaze that didn't let you get away with much. "You okay?" "I'm fine," Hannah said. He looked at the bills on the table. He was 17, not 7. He knew what the bills meant. He'd known for 2 years. "Mom," he said. "Ethan, I can get a job," he said. It wasn't the first time he'd said it. "Tanner's uncle owns that auto parts place on Route 9. He said, "You're in school," Hannah said. "I can do both." "You're not doing both." She said it firmly but without heat. "Your job is school. That's the deal." Ethan sat down across from her. He looked at the bills for a moment and then looked back at her with that too-old expression he'd been wearing for 2 years, the expression of a kid who had had to grow up sideways, not all at once, but in small, relentless increments. "I found the permission slip," he said. Hannah looked at him. "I put it in the trash," Ethan said. "I didn't want to go anyway." They both knew that wasn't true, and they both sat with that truth for a moment in the quiet of the kitchen that smelled like coffee and old wood in the trailer that shook a little every time the wind came up strong, in the particular silence of two people who loved each other and couldn't fix the thing that needed fixing and had gotten very practiced at not saying so. "I'll figure out the permission slip," Hannah said. "Mom, I will figure it out," she said, and her voice had the particular quality that ended conversations not harsh, not brittle, but final. "Now tell me about school." Ethan let it go. He told her about school. And they made dinner together, pasta again, because pasta was cheap and Ethan had gotten genuinely good at it, had developed opinions about pasta that his father would have found hilarious and wonderful. They watched television for an hour. Hannah fell asleep on the couch and woke up at 9:47 to find that Ethan had put a blanket over her and turned off the overhead light and left only the kitchen light on so she wouldn't wake up in complete darkness. She sat up. She looked at the blanket. She sat with that for a moment. Then she went to bed. She was asleep by 10:15. At 10:19, her phone buzzed once on the nightstand. She didn't hear it. It was a text from an unknown number, a 602 area code Phoenix that said only, "Everything's going to be okay, Hannah. I promise." She wouldn't see it until morning. By then, the meaning of it would be entirely different. She woke at 5:17 a.m. to a sound she couldn't immediately place. It was low at first, a vibration more than a sound. Something she felt in the mattress and in the walls before she heard it with her ears. She came up out of sleep the way she always did, fast and functional, Danny's illness having trained her body to go from 0 to alert in under 2 seconds, because in those years there was always something that might need her immediately. She sat up in the dark. She listened. The vibration was getting louder. Not louder like weather, louder like something approaching, like something coming toward the trailer park from a distance and getting closer by the second, in a way that had a direction and a purpose and didn't sound like anything she had a category for. She got up. She put her feet on the floor and stood, and she could feel it now through the soles of her feet, a low, rhythmic trembling of the ground itself, as though something enormous was moving outside. She went to Ethan's room first. That was instinct, not panic, just the reflex of a mother who always checked on her child before she checked on anything else. She opened his door. He was already awake, sitting up in bed with his phone in his hand, his face lit from below by the screen. "Mom," he said. "What is that?" "I don't know," she said. "Stay here." "Mom." "Stay here, Ethan." She went to the front door. She put her hand on the knob and paused. The sound was enormous now. Not frightening exactly, but overwhelming. The kind of sound that rearranges your understanding of what silence is because you realize you've never heard anything this loud before, and the contrast resets everything. She could feel it in her sternum. She opened the door. As the first thing she saw was the headlights, hundreds of them, cutting through the pre-dawn dark in every direction, filling the street of the trailer park, stretching down the road in both directions as far as she could see, wrapping around the perimeter of the park in a line that didn't end. The light was extraordinary. It was like the sun had risen from the ground in all directions at once. And then she saw the riders. Row after row after row, leather and chrome and exhaust fog rising in the cold morning air. Motorcycles packed into every available space on the road, on the shoulders along the fence line, parked with a precision that suggested organization, planning, intention. Not a mob. Something coordinated. Something that had been built with care. Her neighbor Linda, a retired school administrator, 2 trailers over, who had lived through enough desert nights to not scare easily, flung her door open and screamed. Actual screaming, the kind that comes from the diaphragm. Hannah heard it through the thunder of the engines. She heard other doors opening. She heard children's voices, startled and high. She heard someone yelling something about calling the cops. And then all at once, as though an invisible conductor had dropped a hand, the engines stopped. Every single one, simultaneously. The silence that followed was so total and so abrupt that it had a physical quality, like pressure releasing. Hannah's ears rang with it. She stood in her doorway, barefoot in the sweatpants, in old t-shirts she slept in her hair down, and she stared. 500 riders, silent, still, looking at her. Her legs went uncertain. She grabbed the door frame. "Mom!" Ethan was behind her. He'd come out despite what she'd said, which she couldn't hold against him because she couldn't have held herself back either. He put his hand on her shoulder. She could feel that his hand was shaking slightly. "Mom, what is—" Then a figure separated from the front of the crowd. A tall man, gray-haired, with the unhurried movement of someone who had been in difficult rooms before and had learned that the way you enter a space sets the temperature of everything that follows. He walked toward her with both hands visible and his pace deliberate, and his face, when she could finally see it clearly, was not hard the way she'd feared, but something else entirely. Something she would spend weeks trying to find the right word for. He stopped about 10 feet from her door. The silence around them was absolute. "Hannah Monroe," he said. His voice was calm, not loud, but it carried easily in the stillness. Her throat had closed. She managed, "Yes." "My name is Mason Ryder," he said. "You served my brother's breakfast last Tuesday morning." She stared at him. The 5 men, the check, the $67. It came back to her in a single compressed image, the old man's face when he'd held the check toward her, the brightness in his eyes. "I remember," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. Mason nodded slowly. He looked at her with those dark eyes that had seen everything and forgotten nothing, and he said, "The man at the center of that table, the one who spoke to you, his name was Warren Briggs. He rode with us for 16 years. We were coming back from burying his best friend." He paused. "Warren told me about you. He told me what you said." Hannah felt the back of her eyes burn. She didn't speak. "He said you didn't look rich," Mason continued. "He said you looked like a woman who couldn't afford to do what she did and did it anyway." He let that sit for a moment. Was he right? Hannah's jaw tightened. She was not a woman who liked to be seen clearly. It was too close to being pitied, and she had spent 3 years building walls between herself and pity. But this man wasn't looking at her with pity. He was looking at her with something that was closer to recognition. Like he knew the specific weight of what she'd carried to work that morning and every morning before it. "I managed," she said. Your manager took the $67 out of your paycheck, Mason said. She went still. How do you? We asked around, Mason said simply. Not apologetically, not aggressively, just a fact. One of the cooks at the diner used to ride with a man I know in Tempe. People talk. He paused. Is it true? A beat. Then Hannah said, it's my business. It was, Mason said. It isn't anymore. Before she could process what that meant, he turned slightly and gestured a small, economical motion, and something happened behind him that made Hannah's hand tighten on the doorframe hard enough to hurt. About the riders began to move forward, not rushing slowly in a single file that snaked back through the crowd, each one stepping forward, reaching into a jacket or a vest or a saddlebag, and handing something to the person ahead of them until it traveled to the front. Envelopes, some thick, some thin, some with writing on the outside names, short sentences, things she couldn't read from the distance. The envelopes came forward in a relay hand to hand, and then Mason collected them and turned back and walked the 10 feet to her door and held them out. She looked at the stack of envelopes in his hands. There were dozens of them. She looked up at his face. These are from people who heard your story, Mason said. You've never met most of them. You probably never will. But they know your name and they know what you did and they wanted you to know they saw it. Hannah couldn't move. Take them, Mason said gently. Ethan's hand tightened on her shoulder. She felt him move slightly forward, and she felt him take the envelopes from Mason's hands when she couldn't make herself reach out, and she felt the weight of them transferred to Ethan's arms, heavier than she expected, more than paper, and she stood there and breathed. There's more, Mason said. And as if on cue, and she would later learn it had absolutely been on cue, that Holt had been managing the timing of the morning like a conductor the trucks arrived. She heard them before she saw them pull around the corner, 2 pickup trucks, in a flatbed and a van, all moving slowly into the park and stopping at the edge of the crowd. Doors open. Men stepped out with toolboxes. Others climbed out of the backs of trucks with materials she couldn't immediately identify. She saw ladders. She saw tool belts. She saw a man in a gray jacket that said, certified electrician on the back in yellow letters, who was already looking up at the power line running to her trailer. My guys will fix the electricity first, Mason said. The power company is aware. It's being handled. He said it the way people say things when the thing is already done, and what remains is only informing you of what happened. The roof, I've been told, it's been leaking since spring. Is that accurate? Hannah blinked. How did you? Linda mentioned it, Mason said. Your neighbor, she's been worried about you. He almost smiled. She stopped screaming about 20 minutes ago. She's been very helpful. Hannah turned her head. Linda was standing outside her trailer door in a housecoat, arms crossed, watching the scene with the satisfied expression of a woman who has been waiting for something to happen and is pleased that it finally has. When she caught Hannah's eye, she gave a small, decisive nod as if to say, yes, I talked to them and no, I am not sorry. Hannah turned back to Mason. Something in her chest was breaking open in a way she didn't have language for, not pain exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that felt like pain because she'd been holding the opposite for so long that release felt like rupture. Mr. Ryder, she said. Her voice was unsteady now, and she wasn't fighting it anymore. Why? When he looked at her steadily. Because you gave our brothers dignity on the worst morning of their lives, he said. And because Tommy, the man we buried, the reason we were all on that road that Tuesday, Tommy believed that real kindness never disappears. It multiplies. He paused. We're the multiplication. Ethan made a sound behind her. She didn't turn around. She was afraid if she turned around, she'd come apart completely, and she needed to stay on her feet for just another few minutes. There's one more thing, Mason said. He reached into his inside jacket pocket and produced an envelope that was different from the others, not hand-delivered, not personal, but a business envelope, cream-colored, sealed. He held it out. She took it this time. She took it herself. Open it, Mason said. Her fingers were not entirely steady. She worked the seal open and pulled out a folded document, a cashier's check she registered from a bank in Phoenix issued to Hannah R. Monroe. She unfolded it fully. She looked at the number. $50,000. The ground did something, or she did. She was never entirely certain afterward which one moved, but something gave way. Not catastrophically, not a fall, but a buckling. The way a person buckles when the thing they've been bracing against for years suddenly isn't there anymore, and the body doesn't know immediately what to do with the absence of pressure. Ethan caught her. He had moved without thinking the way he always did, just there, his arms around her, from behind, steady and real and present. "Mom," he said. "Mom, I've got you." She couldn't speak. She looked at the check. She looked at the number again because she thought maybe she'd misread it, and she hadn't. $50,000 in her name, cashier's check, real as the paper it was printed on. She pressed her hand over her mouth. Then around her, the 500 riders stood in complete silence. Nobody moved. Nobody made a sound. They just held the space for her, these strangers in leather, with their road-worn faces, and they let her have the moment without intrusion, which was itself a kind of profound courtesy, the understanding that some moments need room and not narration. Mason stood in front of her and waited. And when she finally looked up, when she could finally form language again, what she said was not "thank you." What she said in a voice that was barely above a whisper but was very clear in the silence was, "I don't know how to do this. I've never been on this side of it." Mason nodded slowly as if this was exactly what he expected her to say and was the right thing. "I know," he said. "Nobody does the first time." He paused. "But you'll learn. You've already proven you are good at the hard things." She looked at him. "I just did what anybody would have done." "No," Mason said very quietly and very seriously. "You did what you would have done. That's different. That's the whole thing." She cried then. She didn't hold it back. She let it come, the whole accumulated weight of 3 years of holding it together, of doing the math alone at midnight, kitchen tables, of watching Ethan put back fruit he wanted and pretend he wasn't hungry, of smiling at Dale's pointed finger and turning away before he could see her jaw tighten. It came out of her in a single overwhelmed wave, and she stood in her doorway with her son's arms around her and a cashier's check in her hand and 500 strangers bearing silent witness, and she let it all go. The electrician restored her power at 7:12 a.m. The roofers were on the trailer by 7:30. The mechanics had her Civic on the flatbed before 8. She knew all of this later from Ethan because she had stopped tracking specific details sometime around 7 and had entered a state that wasn't quite real, a dazed, soft, disoriented state in which things happened around her, and she observed them without fully landing in any of it. What she did track was the people, the individual people who came up to her through the morning, one at a time, briefly, not intrusively. A man from Tucson who said he'd lost his wife 2 years ago and knew what the bills looked like. A woman who rode with her husband, who pressed Hannah's hand between both of hers and said nothing, just held it for a moment before moving on. An older rider who had tears drying on his face and who looked at her with something fierce and grateful and said only, "Tommy would have loved you," before walking away. By noon, the sun was fully up and warm, and the trailer park had transformed. She wouldn't understand the full scope of it until later, when she walked through it with Ethan and cataloged what had happened while she was standing in her doorway, becoming undone. The leak in the roof fixed, the broken porch step replaced, the car assessed and with a repair estimate and a plan. The power on, the bills, all of them addressed in one form or another by the envelope system that Holt had set up quietly and efficiently before she'd been fully awake. Mason found her at noon. She was sitting on the repaired porch step, the cashier's check still in her hand, a cup of coffee someone had brought her going cold beside her feet. "There's one more piece," he said. He sat down beside her on the step, not standing over her. "An equal. The scholarship fund for your son. It's been set up through a foundation in Phoenix, tax-exempt, ongoing. People can contribute to it directly. It's in Ethan's name." She looked at him. "It's already funded enough to cover trade school or community college 4 times over," Mason said. "Whatever he wants to do." "He wants to do electrical," she said, and then laughed a surprised, real laugh because the electrician who'd restored her power that morning had spent 20 minutes talking to Ethan while he worked, and Ethan had followed him around with the focused, hungry attention of someone who had just found the thing he'd been looking for. Mason smiled. "Then he'll do electrical." She looked down at the check in her hands. "Why 50,000? She asked. "It's what came in," Mason said simply. "We didn't set a target. People gave what they gave. That's what arrived." She absorbed that, the randomness of it, The uncoordinated generosity of hundreds of people who didn't know each other giving individually, and the sum of it landing at a number that was for Hannah Monroe, the difference between drowning and swimming. "Mr. Ryder," she said. "Mason," he said. "Mason." She paused. She looked at him with the direct, uncomplicated honesty of a woman who had nothing left to protect herself with. "I need you to know that on that Tuesday morning, I almost didn't do it. I stood at the counter with that check in my hand, and I thought about the electric bill, and I thought about my son, and I almost walked it back to the table and apologized and said I'd made a mistake." Mason looked at her. "What stopped you?" "I thought about my husband," what she said. He was a man who did the right thing because it was the right thing, and he never once made you feel like it cost him anything, even when it did. And I thought, what would he see if he could see me right now, standing here with this check, calculating whether I could afford to be decent?" She paused. "I couldn't be that person. Not in front of him, even if he was gone." Mason was quiet for his long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than it had been. "What was his name?" "Danny," Hannah said. "Danny Monroe." Mason nodded slowly. "Danny Monroe," he repeated, as if he were filing it somewhere permanent. "He raised a good son." "He did," she said, and the grief in her voice was clean and real and entirely her own, and she didn't try to smooth it. "He really did." They sat on the repaired porch step in the warm Arizona noon, a grieving brotherhood's national president and a waitress who'd torn up a check. And they didn't say anything for a while, and the quiet between them was not uncomfortable, but full. The way quiet is when two people have already said the things that matter, and what remains doesn't need words. Around them, the last of the riders were slowly moving out, not all at once, but in small groups, the way they'd come in shifts for the morning's work bikes, starting one by one and pulling back to the road. The sound of it was different now. Not the overwhelming wall of sound from 5:17 a.m., but something more gradual, more like a tide going out than a storm arriving. Ethan came out of the trailer. He stood behind them and put his hand on his mother's shoulder. Hannah reached up and put her hand over his. And that was the image that would stay with her longest later. Not the headlights, not the envelopes, not the check with the number that still didn't feel entirely real. It was the warmth of her son's hand on her shoulder, and her own hand covering it on a Tuesday morning in November in Arizona when the world had turned out to be entirely different from the thing she'd thought it was. The story broke the same day the riders left. Hannah didn't know how it happened, and she hadn't called anyone, hadn't posted anything, hadn't done a single thing except sit on her repaired porch step and try to absorb a morning that had rearranged her entire understanding of what the world was capable of. But someone in the trailer park had a phone, and someone had been recording from behind a curtain, and by 2 o'clock Wednesday afternoon, a 47-second video was moving through Facebook and Twitter and Instagram with a speed that Hannah, who was not particularly online, could not have anticipated and would not have chosen. The video showed the engine stopping. It showed the silence. It showed Mason walking toward her door. It showed the envelopes. It was shot from a distance and the audio was imperfect and Hannah's face was partially obscured, but it was enough. It was more than enough. By Thursday morning, it had been viewed 11 million times. Ethan showed her on his phone at breakfast. She watched it once. Then she put the phone face down on the table and sat with her coffee for a moment. "Mom," Ethan said carefully. "I know," she said. "It's everywhere." "I know, Ethan. There are news vans outside the park." She looked up. He wasn't kidding. She could hear them now that she was listening, the low idle of engines, the occasional voice through a cracked window, the particular ambient hum of people waiting for something. She closed her eyes for a moment. She had 48 hours of feeling protected, of feeling like the Wednesday morning had been a private thing, even though 500 people had witnessed it, and now that was over. Now it was public in the way that only the internet could make things public, total, instantaneous, permanent. "What do I do?" she asked, and she was asking herself as much as Ethan because she genuinely didn't know. Ethan picked up his phone. "I think," he said slowly, "you call Mason." She looked at him. He shrugged with the specific one-shouldered shrug of a 17-year-old who has just said something obvious. "He gave you his number, Mom. I watched him put it in your phone himself." Oh, she'd forgotten that. The end of Wednesday morning, Mason handing her phone back after typing in the contact, saying only if anything feels like too much, call me. She'd nodded and not fully processed it because Wednesday morning had been largely unprocessable. She called him now. He answered on the second ring. It went public, she said. I know, Mason said. I've been watching. There are news vans outside my park. A brief pause. How many? Ethan says 3. That'll double by afternoon, Mason said, and his voice was matter-of-fact, not unkind. Hannah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think before you answer. Do you want to tell your story yourself, or do you want someone to manage it for you? What does that mean? It means the story is out now, and it's going to get told one way or another. The question is whether you're the one doing the telling. If you talk to one reporter, the right one, someone serious, not someone who's going to make you cry on camera for clicks, you control the version. You say what you want to say. You don't say what you don't. He paused. Or you can stay quiet and let other people fill in the gaps with whatever they imagine. Hannah thought about this. She thought about Dale. She thought about Ethan. She thought about the cashier's check in the drawer of her nightstand and the $412 gap that no longer existed and the bill she was going to be able to pay for the first time in 3 years without the sick stomach feeling that accompanied every dollar spent. Who's the right reporter, she said. Mason had a name ready. Of course he did. Her name was Carol Vasquez, and she worked for a regional affiliate out of Phoenix who had a reputation apparently well known among people who dealt with media for being the kind of journalist who wasn't interested in making people perform their pain. She arrived at Hannah's trailer at 11 a.m. Thursday in a reliable sedan with one camera operator, and she sat at Hannah's kitchen table with a notepad and a cup of coffee that Hannah made her, and she said, "Tell me what happened, in whatever order you want. Take your time." Hannah told her. She told it straight the way Mason had taught her, without knowing he was teaching her no embellishment, no editorializing, just the facts as they had occurred. The Tuesday morning, the 5 men, the check, the $67, the electric bill, Dale, the paycheck deduction, the text she'd seen Wednesday morning from an unknown number, the sound that woke her at 5:17 a.m., all of it. Carol Vasquez wrote steadily and asked almost no questions, and the questions she did ask were quiet and precise and never once had the quality of pushing Hannah toward an emotion she hadn't arrived at on her own. At the end, she looked up from her notepad and said, "One thing I want to ask you, and you don't have to answer." "Go ahead," Hannah said. "When you tore up that check in that moment before you did it, were you scared?" Hannah considered the question seriously. "Yes," she said. "I was scared the whole time. I was scared while I was doing it. I was scared after I did it." She paused. "I just decided being scared wasn't the same as being wrong." Carol wrote that down. She underlined it. Hannah watched her underline it and understood in that moment that this was the sentence that was going to travel. Oh, she was right. The piece aired Thursday evening and ran online simultaneously, and by Friday morning the headline, "I was scared the whole time. I just decided being scared wasn't the same as being wrong," was the most shared thing on 3 different platforms. People quoted it in comment sections and in their own posts and in text messages to their friends. A high school teacher in Ohio used it in her class on Friday morning and sent Carol Vasquez an email about it. A veteran in Tennessee had it printed and taped to his refrigerator by Friday afternoon. Hannah didn't know any of this yet. She was at work. Well, because she'd gone back to the Dusty Mile Thursday night. Not because she wanted to, not because she needed the money in the same acute way she had for 3 years, but because she hadn't quit, and quitting without a plan felt irresponsible, and she hadn't yet had the space to make a plan. She put on her uniform and she drove to the diner, and she walked in and she did her shift, and the only difference was that 2 customers recognized her from the news, and one of them asked for a photograph, which she declined politely, and both of them tipped her $30 each. She put the tips in her apron pocket and kept moving. Dale was in his office. He'd been in his office, Rena, the morning cook, told her in a low voice, since the news van had been parked outside the diner Wednesday afternoon. Apparently someone had tracked down the Dusty Mile as the location of the original story, and a reporter had knocked on Dale's door and asked him to comment on the incident involving the check deduction from an employee's paycheck. Rena said Dale had not commented. Rena said Dale had closed his office blinds. Hannah processed this information and said nothing and went to work. She was refilling the sugar dispensers at the counter Friday morning when the diner door opened and she looked up and felt the air change. It was Mason. Bah, not just Mason. Mason and four other men, two of whom she recognized from Wednesday morning. One of whom was Holt, who she'd met briefly during the convoy, and who had the particular energy of a man who had not slept enough all week and had not let that slow him down. They weren't wearing their full gear, just jackets, regular clothes, the kind of anonymous that men can pull off when they're trying to move through a space without commanding it. They took the large corner booth, the same one the five bikers had taken 9 days ago, though Hannah suspected that was not accidental. She walked over with the coffee pot. She poured without being asked. "You came back," she said. "We have some business," Mason said. He had a folder on the table in front of him closed. His expression was calm, but there was something underneath it, a particular contained focus that she was beginning to recognize as the way Mason looked when he decided something. "Is Dale here?" She looked at him. "Mason, I'm not going to do anything dramatic," he said. He almost smiled. "I'm just going to have a conversation." "He's in his office," she said. Her heart had started beating in an odd, heightened rhythm. "Mason, I don't want trouble, for him or for me." "There won't be trouble," Mason said. "There'll be clarity. That's different." Before she could respond, the office door opened and Dale walked out. He'd seen the booth from his office window. She could tell from the way he was already arranged when he emerged, already wearing the face he wore when he was deciding how to be in a situation he hadn't chosen. He was smaller than Mason by 5 inches and 15 years, and in this particular moment, the gap felt larger than that. "Mr. Purcell," Mason said from the booth, not loudly, just clearly. Dale stopped. He looked at Mason, he looked at the table, he looked at Hannah, and in his face she could see the calculation happening in real time, threat assessment, reputation assessment, the particular arithmetic of a small, mean man measuring the room and finding himself suddenly on the wrong side of a very large number. "I think you should sit down," Mason said. Dale sat. He sat in the chair at the end of the booth, not in the booth itself, keeping himself slightly apart from the group, which was instinct, positioning himself as adjacent rather than surrounded. Though given the circumstances, it was a distinction without meaningful difference. Mason opened the folder. He placed a single sheet of paper on the table and slid it toward Dale. "That's a full accounting of every deduction you've made from Hannah Monroe's paycheck in the last 18 months that falls outside her employment contract," Mason said. His voice was steady and almost pleasant, which was more unsettling than if he'd been aggressive. "The total is $431. That includes the $67.14 from last Tuesday." Dale looked at the paper, his jaw tightened. "I want to be clear about something," Mason said. "I'm not here as a threat. I'm here as a request. Hannah has worked in this diner for 6 years. She has never been late. She has never shorted a customer. She has never given you any legitimate reason for complaint. The deductions on that sheet are not legitimate. You know that, and I know that, and she knows that." He paused. "I'm asking you to write her a check for $431 before we leave this booth." The silence in the diner was total. Rena in the kitchen had gone very still. The two customers at the counter were examining their coffee cups with intense focus. Dale looked at the paper again. Something moved across his face, not remorse, not quite, but a close cousin of it that arrives not from conscience, but from the recognition that the calculation has definitively changed. "I'll need to look at my records," he started. "The records are on that sheet," Mason said. Another silence. "Fine," Dale said. The word came out compressed and airless, like something squeezed from a tube. "Fine, I'll write the check." He stood. He went back to his office. The door closed. The diner remained silent. Hannah stood at the counter with a coffee pot in her hand, not moving. Holt looked at her from the booth. He was a compact, serious man with gray that didn't miss much. He said quietly, "You doing okay?" "I'm deciding something," Hannah said. He nodded once as if this was a reasonable thing to be doing, while one's manager wrote a restitution check in the next room. "Take your time," he said. She'd been deciding that she realized since Wednesday morning. Since she'd stood on the porch step and watched the last of the riders pull out of her park and felt the particular strange lightness of a weight removed that you've carried so long, you'd forgotten it had a specific gravity. She'd been deciding it through Thursday's shift and through the conversation with Carol Vasquez and through Friday morning's sugar dispensers and the careful, ordinary routine of a diner that had been her entire world for 6 years and that she'd outgrown without realizing it. The office door opened. Dale walked out with a check. He set it on the counter in front of Hannah. He did not look at her when he did it. He looked at the counter. $431, written in Dale's cramped, careful handwriting. Signed. Hannah picked it up. She looked at it. She folded it once and put it in the pocket of her apron. She reached behind her back and untied the apron strings. She pulled the apron over her head. It was a simple motion, the same one she'd done at the end of every shift for 6 years. But this time it had a different quality, a finality, and she set it on the counter in front of Dale with a care that was more deliberate than the gesture required. "I quit," she said. Dale finally looked at her. His expression was complicated in a way she chose not to spend time analyzing. "Hannah, I'm not angry," she said, and it was true. She was not angry. She was clear, which felt entirely different. "I gave 6 years to this place, and I worked hard, and I was good at my job. You know that, and I know that. I'm just done." She met his eyes directly. "Take care of Rena," she said. "She's been here longer than me, and she doesn't complain, and she deserves better hours." She turned and walked toward the booth where Mason and his men were sitting. She picked up her purse from behind the counter on the way. Mason stood when she got there. He looked at her face and read what was on it immediately. "You quit," he said. "Just now," Hannah said. Something crossed his face, not surprise, but satisfaction. The satisfaction of a man who has watched someone do the thing they needed to do. "How does it feel?" She considered the question seriously. "Like taking off a shoe that's been too tight for 3 years, she said. Mason laughed. It was a real laugh, full and sudden and entirely genuine. The laugh of a man who hadn't expected to laugh and was pleased to find himself doing it. The other men at the table smiled. Holt, Hannah would later note, was the only one who didn't smile, though the corners of his eyes did something that was the structural equivalent of smiling for someone who had forgotten how. When they walked out of the dusty mile together, Hannah didn't look back. She'd always thought she had imagined, in the way people imagine the endings of long chapters, that she'd stop at the door and take one last look at the cracked laminate counter and the duct tape booths and the flickering open sign, that there'd be some moment of nostalgic wait. There wasn't. She walked out and the door swung shut behind her, and she stood in the parking lot in the November morning and breathed the cool air, and it was just air. Just the world going on unchanged, exactly as it should be. "What now?" she asked. "That Mason said is entirely up to you." She had not expected the fame. That was the honest truth of it. She had not expected the story to grow the way it grew, had not anticipated the particular hunger that people apparently had for a story about a woman who couldn't afford to do a kind thing and did it anyway. The Carol Vasquez piece had been the beginning, but it wasn't the end. By the following week, the story had been picked up nationally. By the week after that, Hannah had received interview requests from 3 television programs, a podcast with 4 million listeners, and a woman who wrote a nationally syndicated column and whose email, which Ethan had read aloud to her over breakfast, used the phrase "the moral center of a cynical moment" to describe Hannah Monroe of Maricopa County, Arizona. Hannah declined most of the interviews. She did the ones that felt right and declined the ones that felt like performance, which was a distinction she developed an increasingly fine sense for. She was not interested in being a symbol. She was interested in being a person who had done a thing and was now trying to figure out what came next. What came next arrived in an unexpected form on a Tuesday, exactly 2 weeks after the Tuesday that had started everything, when a woman named Patricia Garland knocked on Hannah's trailer door at 10 in the morning and introduced herself as the owner of a diner in Chandler, Arizona, that she had been running alone since her husband's death 4 years ago, and that she was looking to sell. Hannah stared at her. Patricia Garland was 63, small and precise, with the kind of direct energy that comes from years of running a kitchen and not having time for anything indirect. She stood on Hannah's repaired porch step and looked at Hannah with clear, assessing eyes and said, "I saw your story. I read the interview. I've been in the restaurant business for 31 years, and I know the difference between someone who waitresses and someone who runs a room. You run a room. I've heard it from 4 people independently who ate at the Dusty Mile." She paused. "I'm selling for $140. I'm not in a hurry, but I'm not in a hurry either. I want to know if you're interested." Hannah's mouth was open. She closed it. I've never owned a business." Nobody has, Patricia said, until they do. I don't know anything about. You know everything you need to know, Patricia said. The rest is paperwork and I have an accountant for that. She reached into her bag and produced a business card and held it out. Think about it. Call me by Friday. If you're not interested, that's fine. But I think you are. She left. Hannah stood on the porch holding the business card and staring at the space where Patricia Garland had been. She called Mason that afternoon. A woman named Patricia Garland wants to sell me her diner, she said without preamble because she'd learned by now that Mason preferred directness. A pause. How much? 140, That's a fair price for Chandler, he said immediately, which told her he already knew the market, which somehow didn't surprise her. What's the condition? I haven't seen it yet. Have you looked her up? No. Patricia Garland of Garland's Diner, Chandler. She's been there since 1994. Good reputation, no violations. The Yelp reviews are mixed because the diner crowd is demanding, but the consistent complaints are about decor, not food or service. He paused. You could fix decor. Mason, her voice had something in it that was half laughing and half something more serious. Are you telling me to buy a diner? I'm telling you the numbers aren't bad, he said. What I'm really telling you is that you have $50,000, your debts are cleared, and your son is funded. You're not making decisions from a corner anymore. You have room. Use it. She was quiet for a moment. What if I fail? Then you'll have failed at something you tried, Mason said, which is different from succeeding at something that's been making you miserable for 6 years. She sat with them. You're very annoying, she said finally. He laughed. So I've been told. She called Patricia Garland on Thursday. She saw the diner on Saturday. She brought Ethan. Ethan walked through the kitchen with the same focused attention he'd shown the electrician on Wednesday morning. And when they got back in the car afterward, he looked at her and said, the wiring in the kitchen needs updating. Other than that, it's solid. He paused. I could help with the wiring when I'm trained. She looked at her son. This 17-year-old boy with his father's eyes and his father's way of being quietly, competently present, who had been adjusting himself to fit the shape of her limitations for 2 years, and who was now, without being asked, already imagining himself into the shape of something larger. Yeah, she said. Yeah, he said, simple as that. So she called Patricia on Monday. They agreed on $135,000 with a 60-day transition period during which Patricia would stay on to walk Hannah through the operations, the suppliers, the regular customers, the specific and particular rhythms of a diner that had been in the same location for 30 years and had its own ecosystem of habits and loyalties. The story of the purchase broke before Hannah had fully processed it herself. Someone at the county clerk's office, apparently, or someone in Patricia's circle, because by Wednesday morning, Rena had texted her to say it was on the local news, and by Thursday it had been picked up by 3 national outlets as a follow-up to the original story. Hannah Monroe, the waitress who tore up the bill, was buying a diner. The narrative wrote itself. She couldn't have stopped it if she'd tried. Why didn't try? What she did instead was something she'd been putting off for 2 weeks because she hadn't known how to approach it and because it felt important enough that doing it wrong would be worse than waiting until she was sure. She drove to the cemetery where Danny was buried. She'd been there on the anniversary of his death and on his birthday and on their anniversary. But this was different. This was a visit that didn't have a date attached onto it, that wasn't commemorative. That was just Hannah needing to sit with someone she couldn't call. She sat on the bench near his headstone. She had a coffee in a thermos that she poured into the thermos cap and held in both hands. A lot happened, she said. She told him about Tuesday. She told him about the 5 men and the check in Dale's face and the electric bill arithmetic. She told him about Mason and the phone calls and the 500 engines at 5:17 a.m. and the envelopes and the cashier's check and the look on Ethan's face when the mechanics loaded her car onto the flatbed. She told him about quitting, about the moment she'd untied the apron and felt nothing where she'd expected to feel something. She told him about Patricia Garland on the porch step, about Ethan in the car saying I could help with the wiring. But she talked for a long time. The cemetery was quiet the way cemeteries are quiet in the mid-morning, on a weekday, genuinely peaceful, not performatively so. She didn't cry. She'd done her crying for now, And what she felt sitting there wasn't grief exactly, but a complicated gratitude for Danny, for the kind of man he'd been, for the way his being. That kind of man had shaped the person she was, which was the person who had stood at the counter that Tuesday morning with a check in her hand and made the only decision she could live with. "You'd like Mason," she said. "He reminds me of you a little bit. The way he does things without making you feel like you're supposed to be grateful." She paused. "Ethan's going to be okay. I need you to know that. He's going to be more than okay." She sat a little longer. Then she poured the rest of the coffee out onto the grass at the base of the headstone, a thing she'd started doing without planning to on her second visit after Danny died, some instinct toward offering toward communion, and she capped the thermos and stood. "I'm going to name it," she said, "the diner. I'm going to name it something." She paused. "I'm thinking Danny's. Is that too much?" She stood in the quiet and waited, knowing no answer was coming, and knowing also in the way that people who have loved someone deeply know things that can't be rationally explained, that the answer was no. It wasn't too much. It was exactly right. Danny's Diner opened on a Saturday in February, 8 weeks after Hannah signed the papers, 6 weeks after the transition period ended, and Patricia Garland hugged Hannah in the kitchen on her last official day and said, "This place has been waiting for you," which was the kind of thing people said that could sound like nothing, and in this case sounded like everything. The line to get in on opening day stretched around the block. Hannah had not done any particular promotion. She'd posted once on the diner's new social media account a photograph of the sign, the name in clean letters. Nothing else. And the internet had done the rest because the internet had decided that Hannah Monroe was a story it was still interested in following. But she stood in the kitchen on opening morning and looked at the order tickets coming in and felt something she couldn't immediately name. Then she recognized it. She hadn't felt it in so long that its return had the quality of something recovered, rather than simply felt a thing found in a coat pocket that you'd given up looking for. It was joy, uncomplicated, functional, grounded joy. Not the ecstatic kind, the real kind. Rena was there. Hannah had called her 2 weeks after quitting the Dusty Mile when she'd first gotten serious about the purchase and said, "I'm buying a diner and I need a cook I can trust it absolutely." And Rena had said before Hannah had finished the sentence, "Yes, obviously, when do I start?" Rena was in the kitchen at 5 a.m. on opening day, and would Hannah suspected be in the kitchen at 5 a.m. on every day for as long as both of them were standing, because Rena was that kind of person, and Hannah had always known it and was glad now to be in the position to act on what she knew. By noon on opening day, they had served 112 customers. By 2 o'clock, they had run out of pie and had to do emergency replenishment from the bakery 2 streets over. By closing time, Ethan, who had come in to help bus tables because he was 17, and it was a Saturday, and he wasn't going to stay home on his mother's opening day, had counted the tip jar 3 times because the number seemed wrong, and then come to find Hannah with a look on his face that she would keep in her memory, alongside the blanket and the pasta, and I could help with the wiring. "Mom," he said. He held out the notepad where he'd written the number. She looked at it. "That's just tips," he said. "That's not including the register." She looked at the number for a moment. Then she looked at her son. Then she did something she hadn't done in the kitchen of a diner since Danny died. She laughed. Not the polite, tired laugh of a woman managing her reactions in public, but the real kind, the involuntary kind, the kind that doesn't ask permission. "Danny Monroe," she said to no one in particular, to the kitchen air, to whoever might be listening from wherever listening happens after the end. "You should see this." The 1st October came faster than Hannah expected. Well, she'd been running Danny's for 8 months when Mason called on a Wednesday afternoon in early October while she was doing inventory in the back office. A small room that still smelled faintly of Patricia Garland's particular brand of coffee, and that Hannah had made her own by putting Danny's old watch on the desk, and a photograph of Ethan at 12 on the wall, the one where he was laughing at something off camera, with his whole face the way kids laugh before they learn to be self-conscious about it. She picked up on the first ring. Mason never called without a reason. "We're coming through on the 19th, he said. "If that's all right." She stopped counting cans. "How many?" "Hard to say exactly," Mason said. Word got out. She had learned over 8 months of knowing Mason Ryder that this phrase from him was not a casual understatement, but a specific kind of warning delivered in the gentlest available packaging. Word got out when Mason said it meant something was already in motion that was larger than a phone call could fully convey. "Give me a number," she said. A pause. Last count was somewhere around 400, could be more by the 19th. Hannah set down her clipboard. She sat back in Patricia Garland's old chair and looked at Danny's watch on the desk. The second hand moved. She breathed. "I'm going to need more eggs," she said. Mason laughed that same full, genuine, unguarded laugh she'd first heard in the Dusty Mile parking lot, the morning she quit, the laugh that still caught her slightly off guard because it was so much larger than his normal register. "I figured you'd say something like that," he said. "That's why I'm calling 3 weeks out." "You could have called 4 weeks out," she said. "I could have," he agreed, entirely unrepentant. Besides, she started making lists before she hung up the phone. Rena knocked on the office door at 4:30 to ask about the dinner prep and found Hannah surrounded by supplier catalogs and a legal pad covered in numbers, which Rena regarded for a moment before saying, "How many?" in the flat, efficient tone of a woman who had been cooking professionally for 20 years and for whom the size of the number mattered only as a logistics problem. "400 minimum," Hannah said. "Probably more." Rena looked at the ceiling, briefly doing her own arithmetic. "I need 2 more people, and I need the big griddle from the rental place on Baseline." "Done," Hannah said. "And I need the order in by Thursday. I'll have it in by tomorrow night." No, Rena nodded once and left. That was Rena, no drama, no performance. Just the immediate translation of a problem into its component parts and the construction of a solution. Hannah had spent 6 years watching Rena do this at the Dusty Mile and receiving none of the credit for it, and one of the quiet satisfactions of the last 8 months was that Rena's name was now on the kitchen board alongside Hannah's, and she got a cut of the diner's growth, and she knew concretely that her work was the reason the food at Danny's had a reputation that had already outgrown the original story. After the 19th arrived on a Saturday, which Hannah had not entirely planned for, but which turned out to be exactly right because Ethan didn't have school. He'd started his electrical trade program in September, a 2-year certification through the community college in Chandler, funded entirely by the scholarship, which had continued to receive contributions through the foundation Gerald Sims had set up, and which now sat at a balance that covered not just Ethan's trade school, but had a remainder that Hannah had quietly designated for other kids in similar situations, a decision she'd made alone one night and hadn't announced to anyone except Mason, who had said when she told him only, "Yeah, that's right," as if he'd been waiting for her to arrive at that particular decision and was unsurprised that she had. Ethan was at the diner by 5 a.m. on the 19th. He didn't ask if he was needed. He just showed up, which was the Monroe way, his father's one, and now his. The sound started at 5:40. Hannah was behind the counter checking the coffee urns when she felt it, that same low vibration in the floor and the counter, under her hands and the bones of the building itself. She went still. 8 months had not made her forget what that felt like. 8 months had not dimmed the precise physical memory of standing barefoot in a trailer doorway at 5:17 a.m. with her legs going uncertain beneath her. Rena came out of the kitchen. She'd never heard the story from the inside, only the outside the way everyone else had heard it. She looked at Hannah's face, and then at the counter, and then she felt the vibration herself and said, "Is that them?" "Yeah," Hannah said, "that's them." Rena put both hands flat on the counter and felt the vibration for a moment. Her expression was the expression of someone recalibrating something internal, some estimate of what the world was capable of, revised upward in real time. She looked at Hannah. "You knew this was coming, and you've just been standing here making coffee." "What else would I be doing?" Hannah said. Rena shook her head and went back to the kitchen, but not before Hannah saw her press her lips together in the particular way Rena pressed her lips together when she was not going to cry and was committed to that position. The engine stopped. The silence came. And then the door to Danny's diner opened and Mason walked in, and behind him the line stretched out onto the sidewalk and around the corner and down the street in both directions, farther than Hannah could see from inside. Well, he looked good. Better than November. She thought something had eased in him over the months, some weight that had been sitting in his face since the funeral had shifted, not gone, but redistributed into something he was carrying better. He stopped in front of the counter and looked at her with those dark, road-worn eyes, and he said, "You changed the sign." "The old one was too small," Hannah said. Oh, he looked at the sign behind the counter. Danny's in clean, warm letters with a small design underneath that Ethan had drawn a simple thing that was somehow exactly right. Mason looked at it for a long moment. Good name, he said the same way he'd said it the first time she told him, but it meant something different now that he'd seen it on the building, now that it was real and permanent, invisible from the road. Sit anywhere, Hannah said. We're ready for you. And they came in waves the way Hannah and Rena had planned tables of 8 and 10 rotating through, as space cleared the line outside, moving steadily as the line inside moved. Hannah had worried in the weeks of planning about the logistics of feeding 400 people out of one diner kitchen. In practice, it worked because Rena made it work, because the 2 extra kitchen staff Rena had chosen were fast and skilled, and because the menu for the day was exactly what Hannah had decided it would be the moment Mason had said they were coming. Man, eggs, bacon, pancakes, coffee, the same meal. She told Rena, and Rena had looked at her and said, obviously with the conviction of a woman who understood without needing it, explained that this was not a catering decision, but a statement. Mason was at a table near the window with Holt and 3 others she recognized from the convoy, the young one Denny, who had apparently been calling her the Waitress, in telling the story to anyone who had listened for 8 months as though no more specific identifier was required. He looked up when she brought their food herself, carrying 2 plates at a time, the way she'd learned to 20 years ago and had never unlearned. I heard you're teaching a class, Denny said. She set his plate in front of him. Where did you hear that? Mason, Denny said. She looked at Mason, who was examining his eggs with careful neutrality. It's not a class yet, Hannah said. It's a conversation I've been having. The conversation she'd been having was with a woman named Dr. Susan Hartley at the community college in Chandler, who ran the workforce development department and who had reached out to Hannah in March with an idea that Hannah had initially declined and then thought about for 3 weeks and then called back about. The idea was a seminar 8 weeks once a week for people who were transitioning out of minimum wage service work and trying to figure out what was next. Not a business class, not a formal course. Something more like what Hannah wished someone had sat down and done with her 5 years ago. The real conversation, the one about money and fear and the difference between a decision made from a corner and a decision made from room. She'd been developing the curriculum on Tuesday evenings at this table after closing with a cup of coffee and Danny's watch on the table beside her notepad. It's going to be a class, Mason said, still examining his eggs. Maybe, Hannah said. It will, he said. He looked up. You know it will. You've known it since she called. She had. That was the irritating thing about Mason. He had a precise and reliable sense of what Hannah Monroe was going to do, for she had fully committed to doing it herself, which she suspected was less about any particular insight into her character, and more about the fact that Mason Ryder had spent 30 years watching people and had learned to read the difference between someone saying no and someone saying not yet. She left them to eat and went back to work, moving through the diner with the particular ease of someone who had found the right room after a long time in rooms that didn't fit. She stopped at tables, refilled coffee without being asked, said a few words here and there, enough to connect, not so much that she performed it. She had been doing this her whole adult life. The difference now was that she was doing it in her own place, and the bills were paid, and Ethan was 3 blocks away, at the community college becoming the person he was going to be, and the check engine light on the Civic was no longer on because the mechanics from the convoy had fixed not just the immediate problem, but the 3 underlying ones that had been accumulating for 2 years. At 10:30, she sat down across from Mason for the first time all morning. Holt and Denny had moved to another table to make room for more riders rotating through, and it was just the 2 of them, which had become over 8 months of occasional calls and 2 visits and 1 long conversation at the cemetery that Mason had asked to attend because he said Tommy would have wanted someone at Danny's grave who could report back a comfortable thing, 2 people who had met in extraordinary circumstances and had remained in each other's lives because the circumstances had revealed something true about both of them, and true things tend to hold. How are you? Mason asked. Not the social version of the question, the real one. Good, Hannah said. And then because he deserved the real version better than I've been in 4 years, maybe 5. He nodded. The diner's doing well. The diner is doing better than I planned for, she said, which is a problem I'm happy to have. And Ethan? She smiled. It was involuntary, the specific smile that arrived without warning when Ethan came up in conversation, the smile that had Danny in it. He's good. He's really good. He came in last week and rewired an outlet in the kitchen that had been giving Rena trouble, and he did it in 20 minutes and then stood back and looked at it with exactly the same face Danny used to make when he fixed something. Like he'd personally won an argument with the universe. Mason was quiet for a moment. "You talk about Danny a lot more now than you did in November," he said. She considered this. "November I couldn't," she said. "It was too close to everything. It felt like if I opened that door, I wouldn't get back out." She paused. "Now it's different. Now he's part of the story instead of the thing the story was running away from." Mason looked at her with that expression she'd come to recognize. Not pity, never pity, but a kind of serious and attentive witnessing that most people didn't know how to offer, and that Mason provided without apparent effort. "He'd be proud of you," he said. "I know," Hannah said. It came out certain and quiet, and it surprised her, the certainty of it, because for a long time she hadn't known that. For a long time she'd been too deep in survival to have any perspective on whether she was failing or succeeding by any standard that mattered. Now she knew. "I know he would." Then Mason reached into his jacket pocket and put something on the table between them. A folded piece of paper. He pushed it toward her and said nothing, just waited. Oh, she picked it up and unfolded it. It was a letter, handwritten on plain paper in handwriting she didn't recognize, careful and slightly formal, the writing of someone who didn't write letters often and had taken time with this one. It was from Warren Briggs, the man at the center of that booth on the Tuesday morning, the one who had held the check toward her with the particular shame of a man in a public place without enough money. She hadn't known his name until Mason told her that Wednesday morning, and she hadn't heard from him directly in the 8 months since. She read it. He wrote that he'd been trying to put the letter together for months and kept not finishing it because nothing he wrote felt adequate. He wrote that he'd been writing for 30 years and had met a lot of people, and that most of them, when you stripped away everything else, were trying to protect something, their pride, their reputation, their sense of themselves. He wrote that what she'd done at that counter in front of his 4 road brothers and her manager watching from the kitchen was the most unprotected act of kindness he had ever personally witnessed. He wrote that he thought about it on hard days, which he still had, because grief didn't follow a schedule. He wrote that he had a daughter named Maisie who was 24 and who had heard the story and who had unprompted started volunteering at a food bank in Albuquerque 3 times a week. He wrote that he didn't know if Hannah would call that a ripple effect, but that he did. He wrote, "You fed 5 broke strangers, and my daughter started feeding 200 people a week. I'm not sure the math works, but the feeling does." He signed it Warren. Not Warren Briggs, just Warren, which felt right. Hannah folded the letter carefully on its original creases and held it in both hands for a moment. The diner was full and loud around her, the sound of 400 people eating and talking, the smell of bacon and coffee and maple syrup. Rena's voice from the kitchen, cutting through the noise, with a sharp, focused word to one of the new staff, Ethan's laugh, somewhere near the back of the room, recognizable from across any distance. She looked at Mason. "He's been carrying that for a while," she said. "He has," Mason said. "He wanted to give it to you in person, but he's in New Mexico, and he couldn't make the ride this year. He asked me to bring it." "Tell him," she stopped. She tried again. "Tell him thank you. Tell him Maisie is the whole point. Tell him that's the whole point." Mason took out his phone and typed something. He put the phone away. "Done," he said. Well, the morning moved on. Tables cleared and refilled. Coffee was poured and poured again. Rena sent food out in a steady rhythm that didn't slow or falter for 4 hours, which was its own kind of extraordinary. And Hannah made a note to herself to find a way to mark that, to make sure Rena knew that what she'd done in that kitchen on the 19th of October was not invisible and would not be treated as such. By 1 o'clock, the line outside was gone. By 1:30, the last of the riders had eaten, and the diner held only the local Saturday regulars. The older man named Gerald, who came every Saturday and always sat at the same stool and always ordered the same thing, and who had, Hannah suspected, been doing this at Patricia Garland's diner for probably 15 years and had simply transferred the habit to Danny's without breaking stride. The couple from the retirement community on the east side who split a stack of pancakes and drank coffee for an hour and did the crossword from the paper Hannah kept behind the counter. A young woman Hannah didn't recognize who was on her laptop and who looked up when the last of the riders left and said, apparently to no one in particular, "Was that the biker ladies' diner?" and then looked at Hannah and said, "Oh," in the specific way people say, "Oh," when they realize they have just said a thing directly to the person it was about. "Yeah," Hannah said. "You want more coffee?" "Yes, please," the young woman said, and looked back at her laptop with the expression of someone who was either mortified or thrilled or both. Mason left at 2. He stopped at the counter on his way out, the way he always did, not to say anything elaborate, but just to stop to complete the circle of the visit with a moment of actual presence before departing. He put his hand on the counter briefly, a gesture that had no specific content but communicated something nonetheless. "Same time next year," he said. "I'll order early," Hannah said. He nodded. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on it and turned back, and for a moment he looked at her with the full weight of everything the year had held the Tuesday morning, and the convoy, and the envelopes, and the check, and Danny's cemetery, and the diner, and Warren's letter, and Ethan's electrical program, and all of it compressed into a single look between two people who had been changed by the same improbable series of events and knew it. "Hannah," he said. "Mason," she said. He pushed the door open and walked out into the October afternoon, and the sound of his motorcycle starting was followed by others one by one. The familiar cascade of engines that she no longer heard with fear, but with something closer to recognition. The sound of people returning to their own lives, taking something with them, carrying it forward into the next mile and the one after that. She stood at the counter and listened until the sound faded. Ethan appeared beside her. He'd been buzzing tables for the last hour with the focused efficiency of a young man who had learned early that work was not something you waited to be asked about. He stood next to her and listened to the engines going, and then he said, "Same time next year." "Same time next year," Hannah said. He leaned on the counter. He was taller than Danny had been by 2 inches now, which still surprised her sometimes, the physical fact of her son continuing to become himself regardless of everything. "Mom," he said. "Yeah. I've been thinking about the class, the one you're developing with Dr. Hartley." She looked at him. "I want to help," he said. "Not with the curriculum, I don't know anything about that, but with the financial literacy part, the basic budgeting stuff, the math." He paused. "I know that math. I grew up in that math." And she looked at her son for a long moment. She thought about the permission slip in his backpack that he'd thrown away so she wouldn't have to say no. She thought about the apples she'd put back at the grocery store checkout. She thought about cereal for dinner and peanut butter sandwiches, and I didn't want to go anyway, and the particular quiet adjustments of a boy who had loved his mother enough to make himself smaller so she could manage. "Yeah," she said. Her voice was steady. She made sure of that. "Yeah, Ethan, I'd like that." He nodded. He picked up his bus tub and went back to work. Hannah turned back to the counter. The diner was quiet now in the good way, the way it was quiet in the last hour of the afternoon when the rush had cleared and the regulars were settled and the kitchen was doing its slow wind down and everything had a warmth that felt earned rather than assumed. She looked at the sign behind the counter. "Danny's in clean, warm letters." She looked at the photograph she'd put up last month. Not the formal one from their wedding, not the one people usually chose, but a snapshot from a Tuesday morning about 15 years ago. Danny at the kitchen table of their first apartment, laughing at something she'd said caught unposed in the middle of a life that had been ordinary and extraordinary in all the ways that mattered. And she thought about what Warren Briggs had written. "You fed 5 broke strangers, and my daughter started feeding 200 people a week. I'm not sure the math works, but the feeling does." She thought about what Mason had said on that November Wednesday morning, standing on her repaired porch step with a cashier's check in his outstretched hand. Tommy believed that real kindness never disappears. It multiplies. Then she thought about the $67. She thought about the electric bill and the arithmetic, and the moment she'd stood at the counter with the check in her hand and felt the fear clearly and done the thing anyway. She thought about what she'd told Carol Vasquez. "I was scared the whole time. I just decided being scared wasn't the same as being wrong." Gerald finished his coffee and left his exact change on the counter, the way he always did, plus a $1 tip, the way he always did. And she said, "See you next Saturday, Gerald," the way she always did. And he raised one hand in acknowledgement without turning around, the way he always did, and the door swung shut behind him. The couple with this crossword were still at their table. The young woman was still on her laptop. Rena was finishing the kitchen. Ethan was stacking chairs at the back tables. Hannah Monroe stood behind the counter of her diner in Chandler, Arizona on a Saturday afternoon in October, and she understood with a completeness and a clarity she had not had in 4 years that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had torn up a $67 check on a cold Tuesday morning because a man with grief in his eyes had asked her for nothing, and the world had answered in a language she hadn't known. It spoke 500 engines at dawn, and a letter about a girl named Maisie feeding 200 people a week, and a son who wanted to teach other people the math he'd learned the hard way, and a diner named after a man who had believed without ever being able to prove it that decency always found its way home. He had been right. He had always been right. And Hannah Monroe, standing in the quiet of a Saturday afternoon with the sound of motorcycles still fading somewhere in the October air, finally fully knew it.